Hi, good afternoon. This is John Gormally, your host of At the Corner, a Cyber and Blog podcast. We're very much welcome today. We have Lewis Heuermann, cybersecurity educator and cybersecurity specialist in the market. Very nice to see you, Lewis, and thank you very much for joining the podcast today.
Thanks for having me today.
Well, absolutely. And sir, first of all, one of the things I really want to kind of start out with is number one is I had a chance to review your background. Again, extremely impressive. You've been in cyber a very long time. One of the things I always like to ask guests to come on the podcast is, how did you get your start? How did you come up in cyber to begin with when you started your career?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that there's definitely no straight path in. My journey came after the military. I was fortunate enough to serve in the United States Navy submarine force, and in that time, I was able to see things go from analog to digital. We went from very analog communications to doing internet at sea, which was mind blowing at the time. And just seeing that transition just ignited an interest in me for technology. And so when I went to get out after 10 years, I said, what do I want to do with my life? And I heard that network engineering and systems engineering was available as a career path. So I started exploring that. And that kind of led me further down the road. And I ended up one day waking up in cyber. It's just such a broad technology, such a broad industry that you don't really know you're there until you've already been there for a while.
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you for your service as well, sir,
Thank you.
very much. And I think one thing that's interesting is I came up in a similar background where I started in network engineering in the 90s. I worked on cable modems and some stuff here for Cox in San Diego. And eventually I moved into kind of more of a formal IT role. Back then, there was no formal education for cybersecurity. I really got, I don't want to say demoted into it, but I didn't get promoted into it either. It was more like, hey, we're having this problem and something's not working the way IBM said it was supposed to work. Can you go figure it out? Are you still finding today that the cyber issues and events are far exceeding what education is having today? Or do you think education is slowly up to where the kind of the cyber market is right now?
I believe that there's always room for innovation. No matter how far things have advanced, no matter how much education or industry training fills a gap, there's always the opportunity to innovate. And education is always going to be trying to meet the needs of students. And as students are craving more, igniting their curiosity on deeper topics, education is going to rise up to meet that. And sometimes it fits where education is igniting that curiosity by exposing new technologies and new ideas and new thoughts that you might not have considered prior to that course. And that's where I think there's this very symbiotic relationship between the student and learning, especially in cybersecurity. It's just a constant learn. I hesitate to ever call anyone, including myself, an expert, because then the question comes up, when were you an expert? Because the technology shifts so quickly. Newer threats, newer technologies, newer defense measures that we can use. Are we ever really an expert? I don't think so, but I think we can be expert learners and always keeping that curiosity open.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. The reason I have a little smile on my face, I got to attend my very first blockchain event last year, and it is incredibly humbling to sit through people that are experts in blockchain, and even they would admit we have really no idea what this really is going to be. And I think that's a good example where there's a kind of a digital transformation quantum leap happening with blockchain, and people are still trying to grasp, well, how exactly is it applicable other than Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is only a small fraction of the whole idea of using the ledgers and application of data for synchronization security. But I guess one of the things that's interesting is, have you started to see the education community ramp up more for blockchain education, or are they still waiting for blockchain to sort of materialize for it before it becomes kind of the educational level?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful thought. I look at blockchain and those kind of technologies as advanced iterations on some basic foundational ideas of database technologies and different kinds of encryption methodologies. And if a student starts there first and they understand those concepts at a mastery level, then they can start to appreciate some of these more advanced applications of technology like blockchain and some of these different encryption methods that you hear all the time in the buzzwords. It's like, we look at this thing of blockchain and Bitcoin. It's like saying, hey, can you get in a Ferrari and drive? I possibly could, but I'm probably going to crash, especially if I've never driven a car before. and that's where always you stick. It's, there's just so many steps that lead up to that moment that were
Mhm.
skipped if we just say, I want to learn blockchain.
Yes.
That it's probably a more iterative approach or a more tactical approach to kind of step back and say,
Yes.
what do I need to know to appreciate what's happening here? What do I
Yes.
need to learn to be as amazed as the people up on the stage talking about it?
Mhm.
And because the folks that talk about this on the stage, just like you said, they're going to tell you, we're not experts. We're still
No,
learning. Like, no way to
they're
be an
learning.
expert.
Right.
Yeah. And why would they say that? Because there's so many steps to
Mhm.
get to this point of being in awe of the technology
Mhm.
that if someone said to me, how do I learn Bitcoin? I said, well, go learn databases.
Mhm.
Go learn the
Well,
technologies that inform that technology and learn that. Be a master of that. And then you'll appreciate these applications of that technology. So that's what I would say
absolutely.
is, and we definitely see education gearing
Mhm.
towards that. We see a lot more DBMS classes, see a lot more databases popping back up. That kind of went away for a little while, and
Mhm.
now it's coming back. And
Coming
I think it's
coming
because of those technologies.
So it kind of reminds me a little bit if you and I go back before we were gray and young, that when Oracle first came to the market and Microsoft went into SQL, and suddenly we realized going, well, what is Oracle? To us, I thought Oracle was a database, right? And now
Yep.
you realize that it's an entire transformation of how all things work. And I kind of view blockchain today as very much what Oracle was 12, 14 years ago, where it was a platform, but it was well beyond the platform. It really became an entire business or entire paint manufacturing or robotics can run on an SAP or on an Oracle environment. But no one quite understood the full vision of it until people started really using it. And I
Yep.
think blockchain is going to kind of be that, where you suddenly see use cases coming and you start seeing universities deploying it, in their environment to show their students, hey, it's 100 things that could do 10 things. And you're going to have to come into the world and realize that you may have to twist some turns and do some things to really get its full value. But I do like the fact that we do have, a blockchain innovation coming. But from a cybersecurity level side, I think it's incredible. I think it has a tremendous upside to it. Now, does it stop things like humans from being humans? I mean, you mentioned you were in the submarine era, and obviously you remember when it did go from analog to digital. But at the end of the day, it still come down to, do you trust that sailor or that Marine or that Army or that airman? And we had the same thing when I served in the Marine Corps. Did you trust the person next to you in the fighting hole? Right. And ultimately, it does come down to human behavior that sometimes can undo even the most complex and capable security, adaptive controls as well. How do you see then education becoming more personalized, where it gets beyond the bits and gets beyond the subnet masking and the network routing classes and the certifications? Are you starting to see more and more demand to say, here's what it really takes to be a cybersecurity professional, right? And have you started seeing kind of a rise in that as well?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question of, how is education personalizing the approach? And I recall my very first
Mhm.
college class, and it showed up in the mail on a VHS tape. It was I was bound and determined to get my degree when I was in the Navy, and I was
Mhm.
taking correspondence courses, and the only grade I got was a number on top of the paper mailed back to me. That was considered effective feedback. And I
Yeah.
think now in education, whether it be cybersecurity and English or anything, we're seeing a lot more interactive feedback to the student, a lot more how how did
Mhm.
you interpret this assignment? There's more of a dialogue in education now than there was before. And I think that we're seeing that because the students are now teachers. The students who had these experiences of where either the feedback was missing or it wasn't substantial,
Mhm.
at worst, it was damaging. We're seeing a real change in that. I know the worst feedback I ever got was "good job." At
But
best, at best, it's dismissive. At worst, it's an indicator that you didn't care. And I,
but
I
I
think
like
we're
that.
not, yeah,
No, I like that. The reason I like that is that I think that you're leading on to something very important, is that the mentorship in cyber has grown dramatically over the last few years. Not only has educators become educators, but many of them do come from industry before they got into becoming professionals like yourself. And I think there's also a kind of an era of mentorship that a lot of us like to do to the younger generation, to say, hey, look, here's how this stuff really started. Are you finding yourself being involved more mentoring with people as well than you did before?
absolutely. And that's one of the reasons that motivated me to seek out being an instructor and a professor is because when I was coming through, especially when I was in the service,
Mhm.
I had professors who didn't believe that I'd been up for 2 days. They
Mhm.
thought I was just trying to get out of an assignment. They
Mhm.
couldn't understand the concept that I had physically been awake for 48 hours and was
Mhm.
trying to say hi to my family before I crashed, before I had to be back on duty in 6 more
Mhm.
hours.
Right.
And a lot of the vets in the room will appreciate that experience.
Yes.
We're not lying when we say that, and as well as you know as well, that the time out there can be arduous, and you're trying to achieve your personal goals while meeting the
Mhm.
demands of service.
Mhm.
And I promised myself if I ever got into a position where
Mhm.
I could change that mentality, where I could be something more to the students in my class, that I would. And when that opportunity came up in 2015, I took it. And
Mhm.
every time that I have students in my class that are struggling with time management things, I use that as a mentoring session. And
Very
especially in cybersecurity, we're often working in self-directed ways.
Mhm.
We're learning on our own curiosity. We're leaning on our peer group to learn new techniques and things, but you're also very driven by self-management. And if
Mhm.
you skip that step, then you're going to struggle later on. And that's where I try to help my students see that class is just another form of working out in the industry. And so, to your point, absolutely, instructors now are definitely, the good ones are definitely half mentor, half instructor. And that's because we're all incredibly eager to
Yes.
have motivated folks who are curious out in the industry with us. We feel like we're training our peers
Yes.
that are going to be out there with us, fighting the good fight,
Mhm.
locking down networks, trying to keep people and information safe, trying to keep privacy
Mhm.
solid. And that's where I think the shift is, where maybe back 20, 30 years ago, professors saw themselves as just grading a
Yep.
paper and
Right.
passing
And
it on.
doing
Now we're seeing a lot more of this collaborative. You're
yes.
not the sage on the stage anymore.
Mhm.
You're in the crowd with people beside
You're in a
them.
scrum. You're in that scrum culture now, which is like, and I
Right.
really kind of preach a lot on how the DevOps movement is more than just application development. It really is a process of cybersecurity. No longer is it the router guy's problem? Is it the firewall guy's problem? Is it Wi-Fi? Is it database? Is it the app team? It's the models now turn horizontally, where everybody's on the same horizontal plane, working together in different scrums, and travelers moving between the scrums, saying, "How can I help you? How can I help solve
Right.
this problem?" Because as an organization, which is the horizontal plane, we're under an attack. Not Wi-Fi is under an attack or the network team's under an attack, the organization. And I think leadership, and to your point about mentoring goes a long way, even in a Scrum environment. So you're working together with people saying, look, I need the guy from DB to come over to help me because I've never seen this SQL injection attack before. Is it really impacting him? Because right now we have 10 attacks. 5 of them are a problem, 4 of them are not. One's a guess. Everybody, let's work together quickly to decide upon our prioritization of what needs to be fixed. If we were still in waterfall world where we're blaming layer 9 model and saying, oh no, that's layer 7 people, nothing ever got
Right.
solved. We don't have the time anymore because the rapidness of how attacks, including ransomware, propagate is so rapid now, both
Yep.
laterally within the network and, of course, north and south as well. But the lateral movement is happening so fast that you could see organizations be overwhelmed in minutes when before it used to be kind of like a trickling day, type of thing as well. As another thing also is mentioning in kind of your experience as well, are you surprised at a product technology level how fast technology is changing, where sometimes the products that you think, oh, we've got to deploy factor authentication, and then you realize that that multi-factor authentication is not relevant anymore, sometimes within months instead of being worth for years.
Yeah, that's a sort of a tough question to answer because, as much as stuff innovates on the product level, the more
Hmm.
it stays the same.
Hmm.
I see a lot of dashboard companies that are all
Hmm.
just, you're a data aggregator
Hmm.
doing great things, but it's still at the end of the day, it's data aggregation.
Hmm.
Multi-factor authentication is another one of those industry buzzwords that everybody's rushing to do because they were told they need MFA. And
Yes.
while I agree with that fundamentally, there are also, when you have a
Hmm.
wide array of products in your enterprise, and
Hmm.
each one is using MFA in its own different way, that needs to be managed. Even if
Yes.
you're using an enterprise-wide solution like Okta, that's not a fix-all. That's a get a lot, but it's not a fix at all. and that needs to be managed. And that's where cybersecurity folks come in, because
Mhm.
we come in with this understanding that, to your point, that all the layers matter. That
Yes.
we have to cross all those boundaries, and that
Mhm.
while that may fix the MFA solution for one product line, it might not fix it for all. And then
Correct.
who's managing that all part? Who's
Mhm.
responsible for the all? Because
Mhm.
the worst thing is to go into a siloed approach where each product line manages its own execution of the MFA, and then you're going to have gaps all over the place. And that's why I think that cybersecurity just offers so many opportunities. It's if you're sitting in the room and you're saying, well, I mean, I like the tech, but I really like the policies more, or
Right.
I like the legal side of it more. There's room for you. Now,
Always.
you're saying, well, I don't want to talk to people. I'm not really a people person, and I don't want to talk to people. There's room for you.
Yes.
And it's just such a wide industry that my answer to pretty much everyone is that there's room for you. Yeah,
Mm.
back in the day, I used to joke that you had the gray beard in the server room, Joe the Jerk, who,
Yep.
if you wanted anything from Joe the Jerk, you had to bring a box of cookies and a bunch of pleases and tell him how
And
amazing he
right.
was,
You had to
and
bribe him. You had to bribe him. Yeah.
straight bribe,
Right.
and just to get even the smallest of something out
Mhm.
of Joe the Jerk down in the basement.
Yeah.
And that just has no space in today's
No,
world.
not anymore. No.
No, and it's everyone is, and I think we're seeing that in the classroom now, where
Mhm.
things are more agile. As you said, it's
Good.
in a Scrum environment, and that's
Yes.
the way the learning is happening now, the good
Mhm.
learning, and we're seeing that in the workplace. There's no room for Joe the jerks. There's
No.
no room for bribing, especially in a remote world. How do you bribe the IT person? You can't.
He
And
could
so,
be he could be another continent over, working another shift as well.
exactly, and there's just no room for that environment. And so I think that's been for the most part washed out of our culture,
Mhm.
because we came up with a name for it: single point of failure.
Yes.
When you have these single points of failure, either technologically or personnel wise,
Mhm.
you have to mitigate that risk.
Agreed.
And what the world quickly discovered was that the Joe the jerks in the world
Mhm.
that were holding all the knowledge, holding all the configuration data, that was a huge risk.
Right.
Joe the jerk wins the lottery, or if he decides all of a sudden today is his last day, and boy, aren't you guys going to suffer? That was a risk that needed to be mitigated, and
Well, but
that's
it's
why, yeah, I think
it's
that's why
interesting.
there's going in the cybersecurity world now, is because that has been large and in part washed out of our culture, and now there's a huge
Absolutely.
labor.
So it's interesting the reason I like what you just mentioned in that about the guy being the jerk and the fact that he would have all the knowledge in his head. I remember during our time much earlier, maybe 10, 15 years ago, that's what people thought was security. If they knew how to operate the firewall, boy, they can't get rid of me and I could be a total prima donna. What that has changed dramatically, and I thought you articulated extremely well, is that it's no longer job security because you're maintaining knowledge. It's job security because you're willing to share the knowledge. You're willing to be able to work and collaborate is really the job security. Because one day you could be the firewall guy, and an hour later you could be the VPN guy, and 3 hours later you could be the database or the endpoint security. And now because of XDR and everything sort of becoming centralized telemetry of data, it doesn't matter where you fit. You have to prove that you can be a member of a team in a scrum versus saying, oh, you're really the guy. It isn't like that anymore. And I really appreciate your saying that because it was really hard back then to try to explain to people saying, well, God, he's really working. I was on the vendor side and I used to have to deal with people like that all the time. And they'd be like, yeah, I don't want to buy your stuff right now. What do you mean I? We as an organization should not be wanting to buy your stuff right now. And it really kind of went away the moment, to your point, risk of that person. When he went on 2 week vacation, everyone's like scrambling, going, hey, who rebooted the proxy? No one can get out. And I think over time, the industry changed. And I think it changed the way outsource, near source, managed services. We don't have to deal with these headaches anymore. And people started to realize, going, wow, I could easily not be here anymore if I don't prove to be a team playing on the horizontal playing field as well. But I think the way you've articulated was excellent because I was waiting for a term to try to describe that, and I think the way you said is risk mitigation of a person. I think is incredibly important because that really is really something that you have to be around long enough to remember the old days where people really did stuff like that. You had to bribe them to say, "Hey, can I get on Wi-Fi?" No. Well, now it should be like, what do you, absolutely, how can I help you, enable you to be better, right? So culturally, I think we have changed as well. One thing also that's really kind of fascinating to me is, coming more, this is more tapping back to your military and kind of your other industry experience. Are you surprised on how many compliance mandates have now come out in the last few years? I know I remember PCI very well from credit card. I remember, a little bit of FedRAMP. I remember a little bit of FISMA, obviously, but now to see things like CMMC level 3 now surfacing, as CCPA and Cal now surfacing as well. Do you think we have too many privacies, too many mandates, too many security frameworks? Or do you think that because the threat vectors have changed so much that the industry has had to say, well, that's just not good enough. We need additional augmentational frameworks?
Yeah, I think that what we're seeing is an attempt at self-regulation.
Okay.
We've always heard, if you self-regulate, then the government doesn't have to regulate for you. And
Hmm.
if there's a misstep on that, then the government will do it for you. And typically that comes with compliance requirements.
Hmm.
And so we see these privatized organizations coming out with compliance. If you do these steps, then you can arguably say you've done best level effort to
Hmm.
accomplish some kind of security. I
Hmm.
think we're seeing a lot more because of a lot more data, a lot more privacy involved.
Hmm.
It's I heard this the other day, not my words, but I wish it was
Hmm.
that you've heard data is the new oil. It's also the new nuclear waste.
It is.
We
Yep.
we have all of this data now that's no longer needed, but it's still out there. And it has to be properly destroyed, and it
Hmm.
has to be tracked. GPDR requirements, things like this. It all requires someone to own the process, and I
Hmm.
think a lot of times compliance gets a bad rap. It's, well, I'm compliant. I have to be compliant with 15 different organizations, and they all want something new. And then you have
Hmm.
people like me who come in and say, "Well, compliance isn't security." It's like,
True.
who's on first? And
Exactly.
that's a valid question. And
Yep.
really, the reality is that all of these are guidelines that help people navigate a
Hmm.
confusing landscape.
Hmm.
I think the more compliance we see is not an attempt to tell people what to do, it's an
Hmm.
attempt to help them navigate the landscape. And if you
Yes.
see compliance as an enabler to insight, not an end goal, but a part of the process,
Hmm.
then you'll start to see the value of compliance. I know
Hmm.
for one thing, I'm glad that the hospitals I go to are HIPAA compliant. I'm glad that the penalties are as stiff as they are. I'm glad that
Yeah.
their PCI DSS exists so that when I swipe my credit card, I know
Yep.
it's going straight to someone else's bank account. Like all
Hmm.
these things serve these dual purposes of helping an organization
Hmm.
understand what secure means,
Hmm.
and also gives comfort to the consumer
Of
that what
course.
they're doing has at least been looked at by a competent person.
Well, what's interesting is, and again, I like the HIPAA example. I was ready to kind of throw in high trust there just for fun, but I'll leave it off the table. But what I really liked about your comment talks about is confidence. I always look at compliance when I work with people, and I write a lot of blogs on it as well, is really become more of a strategic enabler for an organization to say, hey, because we are compliant, we would be somebody you want to do business with. I know the medical industry, particularly when a lot of them went to high trust for the cloud, really touted it as a marketing value. Hey, we're willing to make this investment to protect your data even more than other medical service firms. You may want to consider trusting us with your data. So I think the good transformation has happened here is that instead of it being security being an expense to the organization, smart organizations are really going, hey, if we are FedRAMP, we now can go after federal business. If we're now CMMC, we now can do contracting business. So even though the journeys are very expensive, to do it, FedRAMP in the cloud is not cheap. But the end result is you now enter a whole new playing field of new customers because you've made that investment. And I think the same holds true to compliance mandates. The moment that organization makes that investment and they more importantly sustain it, which I is part of my next question to you is, seeing the rise of managed services coming into the play now, where a lot of firms don't have the talent, they don't have the resources. I know, the colleges that you work with are trying to get candidates, into the field as fast as possible. But what are you now seeing that even with managed services, what are community colleges doing today to really help put more people on the street and put more qualified candidates out there?
Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful question. When you look at today, and this ties into something else I'd add to the last question, which
Hmm.
is part of the compliance and the getting the business to do it, so to speak, and do that is define the business need. which is
Mhm.
another area cybersecurity presents. It's
Mhm.
not all technical. Sometimes it's helping the business see that it's not just something cool the nerds in the basement want to do.
Mhm.
It's actually empowers the business to go and do more business in certain sectors and industries.
Mhm.
And where the community colleges and the technical schools are addressing that need,
Mhm.
especially with MSSPs, which are a great kickoff point for your career,
Mhm.
is they're helping folks understand the skills that are needed
Mhm.
to understand, to translate for themselves what does
Mhm.
it take to be in this industry, because cybersecurity gets thrown a lot, IT gets thrown around a lot. There's no
Mhm.
roadmap. So what's left? Well, there's certifications. IT
Mhm.
certifications attempt to provide a roadmap.
Mhm.
Some are vendor neutral, some are not.
Mhm.
Some don't need to be. I mean, sometimes you need a vendor certification. Several technologies that are very dominant in our world require certifications, and rightfully so. And so it's not always needs to be vendor neutral.
Mhm.
But with these certifications, they offer some path. And so what these schools are starting to do, community colleges and technical schools, they're starting to address that need.
Mhm.
Education rises up to meet the student curiosity. What do I need to get started?
Right.
And that doesn't always necessarily need to be a 4 to 6 year college university type environment where maybe
Mhm.
you're at a point in your life where you need employment a little sooner rather than later, and you want to do better for your family, and so you want to get into technology.
Mhm. Well, I think that's important to know that that when people are looking at wanting to change careers, or even younger people that say, I hear about this internet security stuff, but I don't think I'm qualified. That's not true. There's such a demand right now for people to get into the industry. I know women in technology. There's a tremendous push on getting more women into STEM and getting them into cybersecurity as well. And minorities and underserving communities are very much encouraged to say, look, there's a career there for you, and there's opportunities in schools to go and pursue it. And I think the good thing is, what I really like what you touched on, is that there's so many different facets of the cybersecurity industry that even if you're not getting in to be the CISO on day one, you may get in as an incident response engineer or security operations engineer, or you may get in as a programmer, or potentially even as a Python programmer. But that's a start. One of the good things I've always encouraged people is, once you've gone through your first hack and you've actually watched the hack going on, you
Right.
realize who really is made for this industry and who's not. Because a lot of times you're having to create code on the fly, you're having to reboot something on the fly, you're having to move a system from one network to the next to save the company from going into complete turmoil. And none of that's in a book. A lot of that is instinct. A lot of
Right.
that you mentioned, it's a lot of it is curiosity. It's okay, that didn't solve the problem. What do we do next? And I think this industry grew from trial and error. So when people think that they're not ready for cyber, it's like, oh, you are. It's just, remember that this is a trial and error. We all learned 30 years ago that it was about, okay, let's try this. Oh, no, that didn't work. Let's try this. But at the end of the day, eventually we stop the problem, but we learn from that. And if we can go in with this mindset of joining this industry like this, or going to schools and learning that, then you'll have a very successful career. But I do think that the way the schools are presenting their content today is much better than it was 10 years ago. I
Yes.
think the fact that it's paths to certification, I think, is very important. But I know also a lot of schools offer job placement and also financial aid to help the schools as well.
Yeah, that's one thing I've noticed at, especially at CIAT, the California Institute of Arts and Technology, that their focus is on the hands-on student, the student that wants to get in. They're tactical learners, or they want to be hands-on with it, and they want to focus on the certifications. And so that entire curriculum is focused on the industry certifications that are most recognized, widely accepted, with the career placement, while also sprinkling in some of the things that I see a gap sometimes in, which are the grammar skills, the
Yes.
ability to write and think critically about topics. Those kinds of things are what CIAT also tries to fill in the gaps with. And so there's cert-based curriculum
Mhm.
starting at ITF Plus, which is zero experience, super interested in this technology stuff,
Mhm.
going all the way to cloud engineering, including AWS, Azure, and
Mhm.
also CISSP and CEH for the certified ethical hacker. So
Mhm.
taking that in every direction. And
Mhm.
also, we just started a data
Mhm.
business intelligence pipeline, which, as well, in the cybersecurity world, just yet another
Absolutely.
very path that you can take, interpreting dashboards. Humans cannot read lines of code at tens of thousands at a clip. They put them into dashboards, and having people who have the ability to, one, pull that information in and then interpret it is another critical skill.
Absolutely. And I guess, and it's education, on hands, having a passion for it, and knowing that the whole element is trial and error is what really grows the space. So, but Lewis, I want to thank you very much for making the time to come on this week's At the Corner of Cyber and Blog podcast. You're absolutely welcome to come back anytime. I wish you very well in your cyber journey, and thank you for being an excellent educator and a wonderful mentor to our industry people as well.
Thank you all.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone, thank you very much for joining this week's At the Corner of Cyber and Blog. We look forward to having you on next week's broadcast as well. Take care.